Hello, friends, and welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. My name is Avery, and I'm your host. And this is an episode that I'm coming back around to because I remember recording it a long time ago and it didn't record, which I took as a sign that we were meant to come back to this later. Maybe it wasn't the right time. Maybe I did a crap job that time. Who knows? But I'm coming back around to it today, this topic of religious trauma. This topic is a super important one that I've been wanting to do for a long time. I have experience with it, and I think a lot of other people have experience with this, and it's something a lot of people are working through, going through, have been through, especially in the last 5 years or so. And it's something that lives deep inside a lot of people, and I think it quietly shapes your life. It shapes the way you see yourself. It shapes your worth. It shapes how you live in your body. It's a form of trauma. So literally anything that trauma has an effect on, this religious trauma also has an effect on, which means it needs to be processed, it needs to be healed, it needs to be talked about so we can understand it and release it. And when I say religious trauma, I'm specifically referencing Christianity, Christian trauma, because that is what my experience was in and what I have the most understanding around. I was married to a pastor for 13 years, and about 5 years ago, I deconstructed my faith, and then 5 years later, I am now going through a divorce, and I have learned so much, and I think it would be helpful to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do. So if you are listening to this, I'm guessing that you either have deconstructed Christian faith, or maybe you are still holding on to some part of your Christian faith or all of your Christian faith. Maybe you're just curious. It could be a lot of different things, but welcome either way. I am never trying to convince you to deconstruct your faith. That's not my job here. My goal is to speak to people who are already curious, who are already leaning towards deconstruction. They're already thinking in that direction. They're asking questions. They're doing that work and are realizing that there's a lot of residual energy left behind if you have been in this religion for years and years. It's not something that just releases and you have a clean slate. These are built-in traumatic teachings that take work in order to fully release. So maybe you're somebody that grew up going to church every Sunday. Maybe you grew up in the church or a very religious household. Maybe you went to youth group every Wednesday. Maybe you went to a Christian school. Whatever it is, I suspect that at some point, at least, you believed that Christianity, that this path was the only way to be good, the only way to be safe, the only way to be loved, the only way to be valued. You may have been terrified of hell. You may have been terrified of other people going to hell. Maybe you felt like no matter what you did, you would never be good enough for God. Maybe you felt ashamed for just existing as your normal human self. These types of issues are all the things that I am speaking to, because you may know that you have this trauma. You may also not even know how deeply embedded this is in your body. And I hope if that's you that this episode shines a little bit of light on that today so that, again, it can be healed and processed. So I want to kind of explore how and why Christianity can cause trauma and signs that you have the trauma or signs that it's not healthy for you, and some of the toxic dogma in Christianity that so often warps people's thoughts into these really fearful, shame, guilt-based emotions. But it's not about hating Christianity or hating religion. Again, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. This is about people who are already hurting and unveiling kind of the truth around these types of strict religions and how they can wound people so that we can start healing. Now, like I said, I was a pastor's wife for 13 years. I spent a lot of years in a lot of different churches. We were, while we met in college, and so while we were in college, we went to one very specific, very, very conservative church. Then we got married. He had a job at a church plant. From there, we moved to a much larger but much more conservative Baptist church. We were there for about 8 years. And then from there, we moved to a smaller Methodist church, which was a little bit more open-minded, but still had its own issues and rules and judgments and all of the things that come with this belief. So I have been in a lot of churches. I've seen a lot of different ways that this is taught, that it's embodied. I have been around a lot of Christians for years and years. I've been on the outside of the church, and I've been deep inside the belly of church ministry and staff and all of those things. So I feel qualified to talk about this topic. I also have a unique perspective because I did not grow up in a super religious family. We kind of like every now and then would go to church, but I became a Christian at first. And I talk about this with my sister in my deconstruction episode. It's 2 parts. So you should go check it out if you haven't heard that one. But I talk about this, how I really got myself into Christianity. And at the time I was like looking to connect with God, and Christianity was the only thing that I was really aware of at that point that I could connect with God. And so I kind of just started going to church on my own, and I prayed the prayer and became the Christian and all of the things because I was just looking to connect with God, with the divine. And this was the only opening, the only option that I thought I had. So I went with it. But I didn't grow up in this church. Now, that being said, I married someone, and I was also around multiple people who grew up in very religious households. And so I very much saw the difference between. Now, granted, I can't judge every single person who grew up in the church from my just small circle of people, but I witnessed firsthand the core differences between someone who grew up in a very religious household and what that does to your beliefs when you are given that as a child, and kind of what that does inherently to your mind as your brain is developing and growing up, versus people who had more freedom around their beliefs growing up. So I will say that. And so I do want to acknowledge that if you did grow up in a very religious household, I see you, and I understand that if you are somebody that is deconstructing your faith now, that takes a lot of work, and you probably have a little bit more trauma because you may have experienced religion in those very young, early developmental years. Now, let's talk about my current beliefs around Christianity, because it's certainly obviously shifted. Now, I believe Jesus definitely was here, and that he definitely was a very highly spiritual, highly evolved person, soul. However, I interpret the Bible and this whole religion and Jesus's entire life in a very, very different way than I did previously. And again, I'm going to share with you where I am at now. I do not care if you align with what I think about Jesus now or not. I'm just telling you this for context so you understand as we kind of talk about where I've gotten to from my own research, from my own spiritual journey, from my own things that I've channeled. I'm not teaching this to you like fresh dogma, okay? Now, you're probably aware with the teachings around Christianity, right? I'm not going to stop there because this podcast is probably already going to be long, but I personally believe that Jesus's parables, his actions, his miracles were meant as tools to awaken your personal awareness, not rules to govern behavior. I do think that a lot of what Jesus actually said and taught has made it into the Bible. However, over years and years and years and years, and translation and translation and translation and adding here and adding there and adding here, I think so much has been distorted. So much has been added through social lenses, government lenses, the lens of the culture at that time. And so I think it's gotten very distorted over time. But I think the core of what Jesus actually came to teach and to share was around your personal power and your connection with God inside. But as you know, Jesus taught orally. And so later, much later, decades later, his oral teachings became written scripture that became translated multiple times and interpreted, again, through cultural lenses, which were often patriarchal, political, based on hierarchy. And so everything that ended up getting translated kind of got translated through the lens of the time. Because honestly, I think it's a little bit unavoidable unless somebody is just extremely aware and able to translate something without any personal bias at all. This was very much something that was almost impossible, I think, at the time to translate without funneling it through their cultural beliefs during that time period. So as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, the religion, as it became, kind of entangled with the government, with power, and that original spiritual freedom that Jesus was trying to share was replaced with control and conformity and moral policing in order to maintain order. Like, it essentially became something that was used to control behavior rather than a tool for spiritual freedom. And not to say that order wasn't needed, in that day and age. Like, I understand there was a need for order to sustain our lives as a society. I get that. But that obviously completely changed what Jesus' teachings were actually about. So what we're left with, I think, is we have some of Jesus's teachings that are still in the Bible, that are still in there, right? What we know about love and service to others and our personal connection with God. And so councils and church leaders of that time determined which of Jesus's teachings would become, like, quote unquote official, which ones would actually make it into the books that were in the Bible, and which ones were filtered out based on what they believed would be appropriate and most helpful for their own goals. Which means a lot of the teachings that emphasized personal autonomy, feminine wisdom, or anything mystical, all of that stuff got filtered out. Again, my personal belief, take it or leave it. But those ideas did not serve the time. So instead, what got layered in was things like fear of sin, judgment, punishment, and those became tools for control or cultural cohesion instead of what Jesus was teaching, which was much more about love and empowerment and personal growth. And so especially after Jesus had died, church institutions basically turned a lot of these teachings into things that were more like rules. And instead of the anti-dogma message that I think Jesus was really about, they kind of contradicted that, and it became a lot of dogma. And so ironically, what happened in the end was that the system that formed in his name, on his behalf, ended up repressing the same freedom that Jesus encouraged. So in many ways, it totally went against what Jesus actually was sharing. Because Jesus included the women, the poor, the sick, the societal outcasts, right? LGBTQ. He included everyone as equals and often placed the people who were seen as lesser than, especially at that time, he placed them at the center of his teachings. He used them often to display what he was trying to teach. And so many of his teachings were about inclusion and about breaking these patriarchal conditions. And yet, what we are left with today is so far from what he was about and what he taught and what he shared. And again, I don't think this was like any one person or institution, but I do think it started pretty quickly after his passing with just changes and leaving things out and kind of including other things. And over time, it just became more and more and more dogma. And so now, in my eyes, what we have is a religion that claims to be centered around love and forgiveness and service to others and all of these things. But in reality, when you get into it, when you get into the teachings, when you sit through the sermons, when you join the churches, you begin to see that under the surface, how much of it really comes down to rules, judgment, obedience, sin, and really no personal freedom at all. And this is where the trauma comes in. So let's talk about how and why Christianity causes this trauma, which, just to define it at its core, we're basically saying when Christianity or your beliefs within religion harm your mental, emotional, or even physical well-being. When they harm you in any way, it can cause long-term trauma. And it starts right from the get-go with this concept of absolute truth, right? Like, that's one of the first things you are taught when you go sit in a church or when you're a kid growing up in church, is this idea that the Bible is absolute truth, that it's all read literally, that there's only one way to be saved, and if you don't follow it perfectly, you'll be punished literally for eternity. We are taught, especially in those super conservative churches like I was in, that this is the absolute truth. God's word is the Bible, word for word, that it was all somehow magically translated without any mistake, without any human interference. Which, by the way, I just want to say, if that were true, if it were true that the Bible was written by people without any human interference, that was just straight from God, written by men from God, if that was actually how it happened, essentially what they're saying is that would be a form of channeling. They would be channeling Jesus's words, I guess through Jesus or through God, which ironically Christians will tell you is demonic, to channel another being. They would never call it channeling, but if you're saying that humans wrote this Bible directly from God with no influence of their own, they would essentially be letting God or Jesus take over and write for them. That's a form of channeling. And that's just like one little tiny example of how, this religion contradicts itself all of the time. There's so many contradictories within the teachings, within the Bible, and what is actually taught. And right along with that, you are not encouraged to ask questions, right? Because you're encouraged to have blind faith, because you are taught as a Christian, and I'm generalizing, there are certainly churches, I'm sure, where it's a little bit different, but from the conservative churches that I was in, you are taught to obey with complete faith, because if you start asking questions, that is essentially doubt in God, which is sinful. And so critical thinking that causes you to ask questions or start to question, the history of the Bible, and why doesn't this align with, this scientific understanding that we have, and how old is the earth, and what about the dinosaurs, and there's no historical evidence of a flood, of covering the whole earth. So what happens here? I mean, there's just so many things, hundreds, thousands of things that you could point out that just do not get discussed within the church at all and are not encouraged. And from my standpoint, anytime you have questions that are discouraged, that you're discouraged from asking questions, that you're discouraged from deep diving into topics that are very unclear, it's a huge red flag. And I witnessed this inside the church as a part of the ministry staff, outer circle, right? Like I was married to a pastor, I wasn't on staff, but in a church setting, you're very much you come as a package deal. Like I was expected to very much fall in line with what my husband was expected of. And I witnessed during that time actual conversations where questions were asked that were essentially skirted. Hard questions would kind of get skirted, or, a shoulder shrug, or, I don't know, but God's ways are higher than our way. If I had a dime for every time I heard somebody say God's ways are higher than our ways as a way of explaining away hard questions, I wouldn't be sitting here recording this podcast because I would have so much money. Just kidding. I would do this anyway. But the point being is that this is a very, very, very common occurrence. Another huge issue, especially if you grew up in the church, is this idea of being terrified of hell. Like for children, it's terrifying. Imagine you're 7 years old, hearing about eternal fire and damnation. Like if you mess up or if you die without saying the right prayer, you will suffer for eternity. Imagine being a child, or maybe you were a child that grew up hearing that, right? That is not spiritual safety. That is existential terror. Thankfully, because I did not come into Christianity until my late teens, and late high school, early college, the idea of hell was never something that felt real to me. Genuinely, when we would have the sermons about like evangelism and, imagine your family going to hell. Like, how does that feel? You need to, talk to them about Jesus and yada, yada. Now, of course, I understand why, but it never really resonated with me. I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess that's true, but it didn't hit me. You know what I mean? It didn't hit me in the heart. It didn't feel like truth and I think this is actually true for a lot of people, because if we really truly thought, if Christians really truly believed deep in their soul that people and loved ones that they knew were going to hell to burn for eternity, they would be on their knees in front of those people every day, begging them to accept Jesus into their hearts, right? And I can say this from being so involved in churches for so many years, most people aren't doing that. Even the most devout Christians are not evangelizing the way they are taught they should, because it's uncomfortable, because it's awkward, and because I believe that deep, deep, deep down, even though they might believe it in their mind and their conscious thoughts, deep down, I don't think it really hits them as truth, because it's not, in my opinion. I don't believe that hell actually exists. I think we have plenty of studies on near-death experiences and things like that for people to have demonstrated what happens when they actually pass and go beyond the veil. That's a whole nother discussion. But regardless, going back to hearing that as a child, that's terrifying. And for many people who did hear that at a young age, or maybe even at an older age, it sticks with them. And it becomes one of those lingering fears that holds them back from being able to leave the religion, because they go, but what if that's true? It's like they want to deconstruct, their heart's not in it. They know there's more. They know there's questions that can't be answered. They want to deconstruct, and there's a little voice in the back of their head that goes, but what if hell is real? And I don't want to burn in eternity. Like, that is what keeps people stuck. That is a taught trauma. It is a fear-based belief. It's fear-based. They are literally teaching you to fear hell as a control mechanism to get you to believe in this religion. Beyond that, there's enforced conformity, right? Where church culture expects everyone to think the same way, believe the same doctrines, follow the same gender roles, follow the same life paths. It really suppresses your own individuality, your intuition, your inner voice, because you become so used to, I need to fit in, I need to obey the rules, I need to do what everybody else is doing, because that a Christian church is one of the most judgmental places on the planet, right? There's no hate like Christian love. Individuality becomes dangerous. Questions become rebellious. Your natural curiosity is labeled as doubt in God or sin. So what's the natural response to that? You start suppressing your questions. You don't want to think outside the box because that starts to feel dangerous. And eventually you end up suppressing your true self. And this is one of those things I will tell you I witnessed firsthand in some of the people around me. This is what I saw. People who had a very low self-worth. They had a very low understanding of who they were, what they wanted, what they believed, because they were so used to outsourcing their beliefs, their decisions to, whether it's a parent or just the church in general, church leadership. Their behavior from a young age was so controlled that they were not able to develop their own individuality, at least not fully. I think there's a lot of people who are part of the Christian church who are genuinely good people. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, they're bad people. They're not bad people. I think they're brainwashed people. I think they're indoctrinated people, but they're not bad people. And they certainly have the desire to love others and serve others. But I think the way that they go about doing it is twisted through these religious teachings, because spiritual authority is used to control behavior. So, lead pastors, church leadership, because church leaders teach things like, don't question God's word. Or if you're struggling with this, that, or the other, you just need to actually trust God. You need to pray harder. And so instead of encouraging growth in people, instead of encouraging therapy or support, it creates shame for even having struggles in the first place. And it silences people's actual pain, people's actual questions, people's actual need to explore and form their own beliefs. And the shame that gives people, it seeps into their bones. It seeps into your identity. It seeps into your nervous system, and it stays with you as trauma. So let's go over this little checklist, shall we? Right? Just a quick little checklist of signs that you may have Christian religious trauma, right? So 1, fear of hell. 2, fear of never feeling good enough. Not good enough for God, not good enough of a person. 3, feelings of perpetual shame and guilt. Shame, no matter how you act. Like we all make mistakes, right? But even the smallest mistake spins you into shame and guilt. 4, fear of intimacy or avoidance of intimacy. Essentially a fear of any sort of sexual desire. And I'm talking like a healthy sexual desire, not a misplaced sexual desire. But this whole like purity culture teaching that makes you feel like in general anything sexual is bad. 5, constant fear of judgment. 6, suppressed intuition, difficulty trusting new ideas, difficulty trusting your own thoughts. 7, this one is so common, people pleasing and overextending yourself for the sake of being quote unquote Christ-like. This is so rampant within the church. And I can say this because I am not a people pleaser, never been a people pleaser, have always been someone who is not afraid to say no. Definitely the person who's willing to look like the bad guy to draw my own boundaries. I don't know how I even learned to do this, because given my childhood, I probably should be a people pleaser, but I'm not. which made me very aware of the people around me who were people pleasers. Because what I would witness in my family and my close friends were these people that would say yes or agree to something or, what have you. And then behind the scenes would tell me things like, oh, I really don't want to do this, or I feel so overburdened, or I feel so pressured, or gosh, I just really don't want to. And I'd be like, why didn't you say no? Why didn't you just tell them? And they feel like they can't. It causes them physical pain to feel like they're disappointing someone. And religious trauma is not the only place where you can kind of develop that sort of habit, but it is certainly one of the strongest places where people develop this toxic pattern, the people pleasing and the overextending. And the last one is lack of personal boundaries, which goes with people pleasing, but this idea where you don't have strong personal boundaries because you are taught to kind of be this like open-ended, warm, loving person, right? To be this Christ-like person, that it almost teaches you to steamroll your own worth, your own desires, your own needs for the sake of other people. Which again, I absolutely do not believe was one of Jesus's teachings, but is very much taught as it was. And by the way, all of these sorts of triggers, all of these sorts of traumas and the residual energy and how they affect our lives is exactly the kind of thing that we go a lot deeper in inside of my monthly membership, where we talk about these things, or you don't have to talk about them live if you don't want to. But I just have lots of different ways where we can actually like deep dive, because there's more space there to unpack it together. And we explore the topics in a way that's more personal and more interactive than just me sitting in front of the microphone here. So check that out in the show notes if you want a more personal experience with these topics. And there's a lot of other monthly spiritual support that you get there as well. Because this type of trauma is something that you need to be able to talk out. You need to be able to process, to identify. Okay, so what would this look like, right? Maybe you feel fear or guilt every time you skip church, or you don't pray, or you don't read a Bible. Or maybe this is you in the past, right? Maybe it's being discouraged from thinking critically or asking questions about doctrine. Maybe it's in the area of natural desires, like any kind of sexual curiosity or creativity or intimate exploration is always labeled as sinful, regardless of it being in a healthy context. Maybe you feel constantly judged for literally just being a human, or for making a mistake, for having feelings. Oh, this is a big one. Maybe you are told that mental health struggles are simply a lack of faith. This one makes me furious if I think about it for too long, because there's so many instances where people have needed true and real help with mental illnesses that religion is not equipped to cover. And so they are shamed for needing therapy or needing medication. I think that's gotten better over the last, 5 to 10 years, but I still think it happens and it's infuriating. Or maybe you find yourself hiding parts of who you really are to be accepted in your faith community, whether that is something like homosexuality, or whether it's something just like maybe you have a quirky style or way of dressing, or maybe you want to cut your hair really short as a woman, or it could be something super small or something really big. It doesn't really matter, but this pressure to conform, right? We already deal with that in the world. We deal with that at work. We deal with that at school. The church is like that times 10. And all of these things, quite honestly, are exhausting, because you are constantly performing. You are constantly acting righteous or attempting to act righteous instead of living authentically, living peacefully in who you are, what you actually desire, what feels aligned for you. And that's exhausting. And if that is still you, which you're probably too offended and not here if it is, because I feel like I've gotten a little bit sassy now. The deeper I get into this episode, the more sassy I get, because I just discussing these things kind of like, I think even brings up these old angry feelings in me, which shows me that I still have some things to process here. These old angry feelings about the church and how it functions and what it expects of people and what they teach people and what they teach women and all of these things. And is that really who people believe that Jesus was? Or what he taught, or what he shared? Because even as a Christian, that felt wrong to me. Even though I couldn't quite put a name to it or explain why I felt that way, I always noticed the difference of, just say, for example, the stories where Jesus is dealing directly with a woman or a shamed woman. You take that scenario, You counter that to later books that were not written by Jesus, or maybe that were written by Paul, about, wives obeying their husbands and things like that. It goes back to what I was talking about with this conflict, this hypocrisy within the Bible itself. There's always a reason. I mean, if you took this into a church, there's a reason that it gets explained away. But the reality is you cannot ignore all of the hypocrisy that goes on within the Bible itself, because it does. It totally contradicts itself, and there's just no getting around that. Like, just as an example, the teachings on male headship and submission and biblical womanhood that are used to keep women, in my opinion, small, silent, subservient. Women are discouraged from leadership. Women are discouraged from speaking up, and they're taught that their highest purpose is essentially serving men. Now, will the church phrase it that way directly? No. They really, sugar it up and make it sound a lot nicer than it is, but that's the truth of it. And again, I say this as someone who wholeheartedly bought into this narrative and this biblical womanhood and this is my role, to be at home with the children, barefoot in the kitchen, yada, yada. And I was a stay-at-home mom for a long time, and I don't regret that part at all. That's not what I'm saying. But it's this idea that, one, that role is a lot lesser than, which again, they won't teach outright, but that is how it's seen. Because let me tell you something, there's a big difference. I witness this all the time. This is part of what got me on my deconstruction journey in the first place. There was one thing that was taught, right? They would teach something in a way that sounded really nice, like, biblical womanhood or obeying your husband. They would teach it in a way that was totally sugar-coated, and it sounded really nice, and it sounded really loving, and they made it all make sense with this hierarchy of God and, God and then the man and the woman, because Adam was made and then Eve was made and yada, yada. But when it came down to actually what that looked like when it was lived out, and not only that, but how this played out in social dynamics within the church, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I would either overhear, or I would just hear a man specifically say something in passing, or even women. It wasn't just men. They would say things in passing, or they would say things, that I might overhear, that were so derogatory and that were so dismissive of women, of mothers. It was like, at first, I kind of bought into the narrative, because as it was being taught as this beautiful way of helping, and you were just the support system and blah, blah, blah. But then the longer that I was a Christian, the longer that I lived inside of that teaching, the longer I actually witnessed it firsthand, the more I saw that the way that it was being taught and the way that you actually lived that out were completely opposing situations. And what actually played out 100% of the time, 100% of the time, from what I witnessed, which was a lot of years of this, was women being disregarded, disrespected, seen as less than, seen as not trustworthy, not respected for their opinions, not respected for what they had to offer leadership-wise, being excluded from leadership meetings, always given the roles of, the nurturing and the taking care of the children, which the men were never expected to do. That was seen as like a bonus. Essentially, it just became this really, really unhealthy expression of gender roles, and the narratives and the wording and the conversations that were had, that I heard with my own ears, were shocking and really disrespectful and really just nasty. And I would hear these things, whether it was like somebody directly that I went to church with, or whether it was maybe something almost like political that was said by a church leader in the media. The understanding became, women are not respected the way that men are. They are not seen as important as the men are. And we value them and we love them so much. In words, not in practice, but in words, we love them so much. We value them. They're beautiful, but they're not respected. And I don't mean for this to turn into like a feminist episode. That was not my intention at all. But this is me just kind of expressing my own frustration, because I just want to drive home the fact that I did not start out believing this way. Like, I very much started out as like, yes, I'll be the submissive wife. Yes, I will, I totally ran with the teachings. What changed my mind wasn't anything on the outside. What changed my mind was testing that way of living out doing it myself and seeing how it actually was and how it actually played out. That's what changed my mind. So let me reiterate here, because I don't want this to be all about feminism. I am not a man hater by any means. There are so many good men out there who are very much deserving of all of the credit and all of the praise for what healthy masculinity actually looks like. I did not find many examples of that inside the church. And that's the frustration that I'm expressing right now. And again, I've got other episodes on masculinity versus femininity and breaking down those roles more in a healthy spiritual way. So go check those episodes out. But before I get carried away, the last thing I want to talk about in this episode is how to heal. How do you heal from this religious trauma? Like, okay, I have all this trauma. Yeah, I went through that. Yeah, I do see some of the symptoms of this religious trauma in my life. What do I do now? I mean, the first step, which in processing or healing any sort of trauma or feelings, is just recognizing it, just knowing that it's there, just seeing it. That's a huge part of healing it. Because you can't heal it if you don't know it's there. Beyond that, and again, I've got whole episodes on processing trauma and things like that, but reclaiming your inner authority, first of all. Because again, one of the biggest wounds that I saw from people who had like the most trauma that stuck with them and really affected their lives for years and years and years and years is the lack of inner authority, the lack of understanding their own worth and their own authority, the authority to make their own decisions, the authority to think outside the box, to critical think, to think something that went against what everyone was telling them. Not because it went against, but just because they were thinking something that they weren't being directly told. Not everyone can do that. And that's an important step in developing yourself as an individual. Healing comes when you honor your own discernment instead of defaulting to conditioned guilt or fear or obedience. Recognizing that your inner guidance matters more than the external rules you were used to hearing. Also, release the guilt and the fear. There is so much guilt and fear left over in so many people from religion, tied to sin, tied to punishment, tied to failure. Really, a big thing that you almost need to work on is just forgiveness. Forgive yourself for judging yourself. Like, visualize the release of this fear-based energy from your body, because this idea of forgiveness is the idea of letting go. When you forgive something, you let it go. So doing energetic forgiveness work, you are letting go of the fear-based energy out of your body. You've got to retrain your body. You've got to retrain your mind to know that you are worthy and you are loved exactly as you are, not because you are obedient to any sort of rule. Also, a big one is unlearning the dogma. Unlearning the dogma. Consciously noticing where old teachings are still influencing your choices and your beliefs. Whether it is gender roles, whether it is obedience, whether it is people-pleasing. All of these areas, this takes a long time to undo. The longer you were in the church, the longer it will take to unwind these beliefs from your inner knowing. But again, the best way to do that is just to notice them. Just consciously notice where those things still exist in your beliefs, in your choices. And when you notice them, you can replace them. When you notice you're falling into toxic gender roles, when you notice that you are judging others for doing something that's different from you, or if you're feeling judged by others, notice if you're feeling guilt and shame over something that is not done with hate or bad intentions. Replace those dogmatic beliefs with love, discernment, and personal empowerment. And then just exploring your own spiritual experience. The beautiful part of deconstructing Christianity is that you become freed. It's so ironic to use the term like freed from chains because that is such a Christian term. But ironically, I'm going to use it. The beautiful thing from deconstructing Christianity is that you release yourself from the chains of obeying beliefs that you did not come to on your own, obeying these biblical teachings that someone else told you were absolute truth. You get to let go of all of that, and you get to decide, this is what resonates with me. This is what resonates with my soul. When I look inward and I connect with God on my own, this is what feels like truth to me. Learning to trust yourself again is a huge step. Focus on feeling God, on feeling the divine directly within yourself, not relying on other people, not relying on rituals, not relying on rules, not relying on reading a Bible to connect with God. You don't need any of that. God exists within you. You are part of God as you are. You cannot be separated from God. And so after you deconstruct, you're free from that, right? And now you're allowed to feel anger. You're allowed to feel grief. You're allowed to feel confused. You're allowed to acknowledge your trauma. You're allowed to acknowledge your shadows, the parts of yourself that were shamed or that were suppressed. Every wound that you can point out and acknowledge is something that you can work through, process, transform. And the end goal is really just about stepping into a place where you feel spiritually aligned, where you feel aligned with your own beliefs in a way that feels authentic to you. All right, I'm getting a little bit Hallmark cardy here at the end, but I hope that this episode was helpful and that you kind of gained some clarity around religious trauma if this is something that you've dealt with in the past. I hope that this helped you in some way, shape, or form. Just a reminder, if you want to connect deeper, check out the show notes to see more about my monthly membership. Please leave the podcast a review if you have enjoyed it. You can always email me at daremetoprosper@gmail.com if you have any questions or you want to connect. And until then, I'll see you guys in my next episode. Bye.